Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first Public Information Center for the Newmarket Townwide Urban Design Guidelines. Of course, we were hoping to have this presentation in person, but given the pandemic and in the interest of making sure that everyone stays happy and healthy, and also, of course, recognizing the impacts that the pandemic has had on people's personal schedules, we opted instead to record this presentation and post it online on the project's website, hoping that anyone interested in taking part would be able to view this at their convenience and at a time that works for them. So thank you again for joining us. My name is Matt Reed. I'm the principal of planning and policy at Foten Planning and Design here in Toronto, and I'm the overall project manager for the townwide urban design guidelines. And on behalf of myself and my team, I would like to say that we're really excited to be kicking off our first consultation for this project and to be starting to gather feedback and input from the most important stakeholders, the people who live, work, and play in Newmarket, and the people who will really help us to inform the urban design guidelines. Tonight's presentation will start with an overview of the project. So we'll give a little bit of a background on how the project is coming together, kind of how it's breaking down by phase and what the different timelines are, and most importantly, when opportunities for public involvement will be throughout the process. I'll give an overview of our project team. I'll give a bit of a rundown on the municipality's current background policies and planning policies that we've reviewed to date and their impacts on the urban design guidelines. But we really hope today that the brunt of this presentation will be about giving a bit of a primer on urban design, or urban design 101, if you would. So talking about what urban design is, why is urban design important, and what are urban design guidelines? Why are urban design guidelines important? And I think key to this study is, why are urban design guidelines important in the town of Newmarket? And then, of course, we're hoping to spend some time walking you through some of the different building typologies that we'll be looking at through this study that you'll see coming up through this consultation, as well as the next Public Information Center as well. So this won't come as a surprise to anyone, but Ontario is growing. And much of this growth is due to be concentrated within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which has been projected to hit almost 15 million people by 2051. And to put that in context, since the last census date in 2016, the population of the Greater Golden Horseshoe was 7.8 million. So that's growth of almost 2 times. So fortunately for us as planners, we have a very strong planning framework in place that ensures that this growth doesn't happen haphazardly, and that it's actually distributed evenly across the province. And at the provincial level, we have the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which allocates all of this projected growth across the various regions within the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And for the York region, the growth plan has said that the expectation is that the York region will grow from 1.1 to 1.3 million people by 2051. And then at the regional level, this growth is then directed to the various municipalities across the region through the regional official plan. And in the regional official plan, Newmarket is expected to accommodate an additional 5,200 people by 2031. And in our official plans, we have a bit of a shorter planning horizon than the growth plan would. So all this goes to say basically is that growth within Newmarket is really mandated at the provincial level. So we can't really just say we don't want it, or we would like for everything to stay the same. That's not really an option here. But the great news is that all these different documents, from the growth plan to the regional official plan to the town of Newmarket official plan, have one thing in common, and that's that they're really pushing to make sure that this growth happens in an orderly and sustainable manner. And mostly this means through intensification. So focusing development within the existing built up areas, either through infill on vacant or underutilized lots, or by the promoting more intense uses along some of the key nodes and corridors across the town of Newmarket, where you can really maximize that access to existing infrastructure and services. So things like transit access, existing servicing, open space and parks, community services and amenities, and all those different elements. However, as this growth occurs, the town staff starts to get different development pressures, and they start to see a lot of applications that maybe not be or maybe aren't something that they typically see in the town of Newmarket. So things like maybe new forms of townhouses or more intense forms of townhouses, like stacked or back to back or even stacked back to back townhouses. Things like obviously tall buildings, and things that don't necessarily some people maybe feel like they don't fit within the Newmarket context. So this is really the impetus for the urban design guidelines, because ultimately urban design guidelines provide an evaluation tool for the municipality and for town staff to be able to review these development applications and make sure that all new development promotes high quality design and supports the growth of healthy, vibrant, and complete communities. So my team, this project is obviously overseen by the town of Newmarket's town planning staff, and we're working very closely with them and collaborating with them throughout this process. And as I mentioned, my name is Matt Reed. I'm the project manager, and working with me on this process would be Ute Maya Giambattista. Ute is our principal of urban design, and she'll be the lead urban designer on this project, really overseeing how the guidelines come together and the different guidelines. And working closely with both Ute and I will be Evan Truong. Evan is a senior urban designer in our Toronto office as well. And Evan will be helping to sort of oversee the preparation of all the different deliverables for the town-wide urban design guidelines. And then finally, rounding out our team, we have Brandon Lin, who is an urban designer in our Toronto office. And Brandon is really our guy who specializes in the preparation of graphics and document layout and everything. So when you see this document at the end of the day and you think, wow, that looks really nice, you'll have Brandon to thank for that. The process. This project kicked off in January of 2020, but unfortunately, again, given the pandemic, it's been on hold for a relatively large amount of time. Prior to that, however, we kicked off phase one, which was about reviewing the town's existing background and planning policies and wrapping our head around how these can be used to help inform the town-wide urban design guidelines. When the project went on hold, we were preparing for this first public information center and ultimately trying to decide how we wanted to proceed. So initially, we were wondering if it could still be done in person, and then whether we wanted to do it online, or maybe we wanted to wait and see if things opened up again, and then we could come back and do it in person. However, again, as mentioned, we've ultimately decided to go this route and do it online. But all that goes to say, we're really excited because for us, this is a fresh start for the project, and we're excited to get your feedback and really kick off this process again. So following this public information center, we'll move into phase two, which is where we'll actually prepare a draft of the townwide urban design guidelines, making sure that when we come back to you the next time in early 2021, we'll be able to bring you a draft of the key guidelines and get your feedback on a very tangible deliverable. And we're really excited about that engagement session as well. And then following this second public engagement, we'll move into phase three, which is where we'll work very closely with the town to finalize the urban design guidelines based on the feedback that we've received in order to be able to come back and present them to council, hopefully for adoption. The final phase of this process, and this one is pretty unique for these types of studies, so we're really excited for this, is that following the adoption of the guidelines, we'll be able to work closely with the town for a period of 3 years to help them to review development applications as they come in utilizing the town-wide urban design guidelines. And as part of this, also helping staff to get used to using the guidelines as well for evaluating applications. And this is really an exciting opportunity for us because anytime we prepare a document like this, we usually write in a certain period of time where the document should be up for review and amendment. And what this does is it allows us to apply and utilize the document in practice and maybe identify over those few years areas or sections of the guidelines, or maybe just specific elements of specific guidelines that we thought would work really well in theory, but in practice have maybe created some issues and could use some tweaking in order to make sure that at the end of the day, we have the best product possible for the town as part of this process. So as mentioned, the first stage of this project was really to do a review of the town's existing policies. So I had mentioned previously that from the provincial level all the way down to the regional level and the municipal level, there's a strong policy process in place to really promote and create the creation of municipalities with strong urban design and to create really great and sustainable places. But I think we really need to specifically mention a number of key elements at the municipal level because over the last decade or so, the town of Newmarket has done a significant amount of work to put the right policies in place to ensure that growth happens appropriately and that growth creates really strong places. And at the top of this planning policy is really the Newmarket official plan. And what the official plan does is it's kind of the highest level document that determines how and where growth should occur across the town. And it provides high level urban design policies as well, related to things like sustainability, compatibility between different uses, active transportation and streetscaping, as well as specific policies for places like, policies to protect the historic downtown. But really, as a core goal, and maybe most relevant to this process, the official plan really directs and targets growth towards some key urban centers, um, such as the Yonge and Davis urban centers, as well as around the Newmarket GO station and the Moolock station. So these are those areas, again, where existing services can really accommodate this amount of intensification and can really help to make the most efficient use of existing services. Now, those policies in the official plan are relatively high level again, but they do really set the foundation and the stage for the more detailed policies. And a lot of these more detailed policies come in the secondary plans. So secondary plans are really an extension of the official plan, and they look in at a more granular level at these different areas, again, such as the Yonge and Davis urban centers, as well as the secondary plan for Moolock Station. And these areas really look in a lot greater detail, and they start to focus in more on things like, specific land uses and height and massing, as well as some high-level guidance related to transitions, angular planes, shadows and sky views, the design of different building elements. So all of these different things, taking those high level principles from the overall official plan and speaking directly to those contexts and those more specific areas. And then, of course, there's been a number of amendments to the official plans as well, which really help to, again, sort of further this creation of strong and great places. And one of the most notable ones that I want to mention, and one that I think is maybe most relevant to this study, is the official plan and zoning amendments to implement the findings of the established neighborhood study. And the established neighborhood study really tried to characterize all the different neighborhoods across the town of Newmarket and provide a number of policies to ensure that as new growth occurs within and around these neighborhoods, that it happens at a scale that is compatible with the existing built form and the existing neighborhood dwellings. And then finally, there's the Parks Manual and the Parkland Dedication Bylaw. And these are key elements in the policy framework because they really or relevant to these guidelines because they really set the stage for the guidelines that will address public open spaces. And I think the key thing here is really the Parkland Dedication Bylaw. So the Parkland Dedication Bylaw builds on the parkland dedication requirements of the Planning Act, which allow a developer or require a developer to assign a certain amount of a development to public open space, or to also have the ability to provide cash in lieu that can be used to upgrade, enhance, or create new public spaces within close proximity of that area. However, the town of Newmarket is taking this one step further to actually require to implement the Parkland Dedication Bylaw, which actually builds on this to require that developments of a certain size, so over 1,000 meters squared, are actually required to provide parkland directly on their site, up to a certain percentage, and then they can also provide cash in lieu, but they can't provide complete cash in lieu and not build that park space. And this really goes a long way to helping to create a system of a connected system of parks and open spaces throughout the town. So what exactly is urban design then? So, when we think about our cities, there's a lot of things that really define, some of the greatest cities. So thinking of things like the development or, the adaptive reuse of buildings, but really the buildings in general. When we think about the streetscapes, we think about the open spaces and the natural areas. And these are the elements, if you think of some of the best places that you've visited or lived, these are the things that really make our cities great. And an urban designer is really, or urban design is about balancing the arrangement and design of all of these different elements in order to create a cohesive and orderly whole. So for me as an urban designer, I'm a planner, but an urban designer can also be an architect or a landscape architect. We're really concerned with how these different elements interact with each other. So, for example, where an architect may be mostly concerned about sort of a building and how it looks and how it performs, an urban designer is more about the building and how it interfaces with the streetscape and how those two things work together to create a great space where people want to be. And another key factor with urban design is that urban design is closely tied to the ideas of placemaking or sense of place and creating places that are really recognizable, memorable, and have meaning to the people who visit and live there. And places with a strong sense of place are really places that are, they're aesthetically pleasing. They have really strongly defined landmark, views, public art, and different elements within the public realm. And because of all this, they're places that people want to go. So they tend to be vibrant and active. But most importantly, places with a strong sense of place are places that are context sensitive. So they really reflect the areas in which they are located. They reflect the history, they reflect the people, and all of that. So then what are urban design guidelines? Urban design guidelines are really, they're a tool that provide clear direction for how land should be developed using just text and diagrams and best practice precedent images in order to achieve a desired level of design quality for all these different elements of the physical environment, like buildings, streetscapes, and open spaces. And I think one of the key things to really stress here is that urban design guidelines are not policy. So they're not by law. You don't necessarily have to follow them, but what they do is they illustrate how those higher level policies within things like the official plan and the secondary plans, which those are essentially law. You do have to do those when you're developing, and urban design guidelines illustrate how those elements can really be accommodated or implemented at the ground level throughout a design. And urban design guidelines, they can be applicable to a specific scale. So they can be sort of like neighborhood wide, or in the case of the new market guidelines, they can be citywide. They can be place specific. So they can be about, specifically a downtown, or they could be about a university campus. Or alternatively, they can be typology based. So you could look at guidelines for just tall buildings or mid-rise buildings or low-rise buildings or open spaces, which again is part of the approach that we're taking in these new market guidelines. And really, guidelines can be a mixture of all of those different things, which you'll see throughout this process. And finally, urban design guidelines, they really represent best practices and they should be used to facilitate meaningful discussions between planning staff and members of the development community. So they really shouldn't be interpreted as a Bible, if you would, or as the only way that things can be done. They really set the stage and they provide the kind of the overall guidance for how buildings and open spaces and all those elements should perform. And they put the onus on the development community to achieve the intent of the guidelines. And if there are alternative ways to do that, that's really welcome throughout this process and throughout the evaluation utilizing these guidelines. So why do we need guidelines specifically in the town of Newmarket? And I think one of the key things to mention here is that because we're talking, at the end of the day about intensification, new development rarely happens, under the guise of intensification in a vacuum, right? Instead, new development really will happen. It'll happen at the edge of our existing communities. In a lot of cases, it'll happen right in our existing communities. So while these higher level documents like your official plan and your secondary plans, while they provide a lot of high level guidance, they don't really provide the detailed guidance that allows the buildings respond to their existing context. So that's what urban design guidelines do. They really get down to that finest grain level of detail and start to look at sort of the numbers, the performance standards, and all the different elements to make sure that as new development occurs, whether we're talking low-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings, tall buildings, that it occurs in a way that really reflects and responds to and builds off of the existing and surrounding context. So who will use the urban design guidelines? And I think there's kind of a few ways to look at this, because the guidelines are really used in a few kind of informal ways, but also in formal ways throughout the development approval process as well. At an informal level, early on in the process, one of the great things that urban design guidelines do is they really create a level of certainty for the development community. So they illustrate the town's vision for growth, so where that growth should occur, what it should look like, etc., so that anyone looking to develop or invest in the town of Newmarket sort of has a leg up, and they know what the municipality will be expecting. So it's always our ideal that developers and their design teams, so their architects, urban designers, and planners, will use the guidelines early on in the process to help inform their designs before they even come or sort of submit their development applications. And then formally, when they do, however, the municipality actually uses the urban design guidelines as a way to evaluate the development applications. So to use essentially a checklist to go through the guidelines and say, have they done this? Yes or no? And then always there's the opportunity and the flexibility in there for the developer to respond to either why they were not able to achieve a guideline, or maybe how they achieve the intent of the guideline in an alternative way. And then finally, as a sort of a more informal use, I think we should mention that one of the ways guidelines are also used and who should use them is the general public. So more so than your higher level policies like your official plans and secondary plans and your more technical documents like zoning bylaws, urban design guidelines tend to be a little bit easier to pick up and read. So oftentimes members of the public will use them to, for the same reason, to kind of go through them quickly and get an idea of where the town or how the town envisions growth and where it will occur and what it will look like. And guidelines are really great for that as well. And given that, that's really, underscores your role in this process, which is to help us and provide us the feedback, because what we bring to this process is the training and the understanding around urban design best practices, but we're really looking for your help through these public information centers to translate these best practices to the Newmarket context. So to make sure that we know, to make sure that we take these best practices, translate them to the Newmarket context, and ensure that we have a really made for Newmarket solution. So as I mentioned, one of the approaches we'll take to these guidelines is a typology approach, breaking the guidelines into sections based on the different types of buildings that will likely be occurring through intensification within the town of Newmarket over the coming decades. And the buildings we'll be looking at are low-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings, high-rise buildings, and privately owned public spaces. Not a building, but very important in the future growth of the town. And we like this building or this sort of typology process as a way of breaking up our urban design guidelines, because what it does is it helps to ensure a streamlined document that is really easy to reference. So, if you're a developer, for example, and you're proposing a development that just has low and mid-rise buildings, you just go to those two sections of the document and you don't have to sort of read it from front to back. So it makes it much more of a usable document. But most importantly, why we like these building typologies is because it allows us to create sort of higher level guidelines that put the performance standards in place and the direction in place that allow them to sort of respond to their individual contexts. And a great example of this is for mid-rise buildings, which often have their height defined by a 1-to-1 ratio with the width of the street in which they're situated. The first type of building that we're going to look at is low-rise buildings. And when we say low-rise buildings, we mean buildings that are 4 stories or less in height. So this could be single or semi-detached dwellings, townhouses, including standard, back-to-back, stacked, or even stacked back-to-back townhouses as the most intense form of townhouse, or walk-up apartment buildings. These low-rise buildings provide the transition between the higher density uses, like your mid-rise and tall buildings, down to the existing and established neighborhoods. So given their proximity to these existing neighborhoods, or potentially their location within these existing neighborhoods, the main focus of our urban design guidelines when we're talking about low-rise building typologies is that focus on neighborhood character. So making sure that no matter what the development looks like, it fits within its existing context. And this doesn't mean making sure that buildings look exactly like what is currently present in the neighborhood. It could be the development of a more contemporary building, but making sure that it reflects the design elements that make the neighborhood special or that characterize the neighborhood. So this could be things like the overall height of the roof lines, or maintaining the size and scale of windows, or one of the things that comes up a lot is making sure that you maintain a similar kind of building size to lot ratio. So if you have smaller houses on larger lots, making sure that this character of spacious properties carries through new development. And then, of course, given that some of these low-rise buildings are near established residential buildings and neighborhoods, but are maybe at a more significant height, the guidelines will really be about making sure that the overall massing and design of these buildings will minimize overlook and that they're stepped back or appropriately masked to make sure that there's no privacy issues or shadowing. The next type of building we'll look at is mid-rise buildings. And when I say mid-rise buildings, I mean buildings that are between 5 and 7 stories in height. And mid-rise buildings they're really ideal for accommodating a significant amount of density in a lower form that is much more kind of human scale and really helps to frame streets and create really great public spaces. And the value of a mid-rise building is if you think about maybe one 12-story building, but instead of doing that on a block, if you could have two 6-story buildings. So again, it's really about spreading that density out in a lower form. And again, given the relationship and the importance of mid-rise buildings in defining the streetscape, this is really our focus when we create urban design guidelines around mid-rise buildings. So it is, what is that relationship to the streets? Ultimately, that focuses on the design of the lower levels of the buildings and how they perform in relation to the street. So looking at the podium, looking at the at-grade uses and the design of the at-grade uses, making sure that above this podium, buildings are appropriately masked to step back and make sure that they provide ample sun throughout the day on the main streets, because these buildings are often located along the main streets. Making sure that, as a pedestrian, when you're on the ground looking up at these buildings, that you have clear views to the sky. And then, of course, again, given the location of these buildings, often as transitional buildings or located in close proximity to established neighborhoods, making sure that at the backside of these buildings that they're appropriately designed and masked to transition to adjacent stable residential neighborhoods and mitigate any impacts that they may have over those uses. The final type of building typology we'll look at is high-rise buildings. And while we can accommodate a lot of the growth across the town of Newmarket in low and mid-rise buildings, there still will be, proposals for or development pressure for taller buildings, and as there should be, because taller buildings, really help to define our cities and towns, and they really are an important part of great cities and towns because they ultimately create those strong landmarks and those kind of wayfinding elements, and they help to define really unique and interesting skylines that make our cities exciting and engaging. So there is a place for tall buildings for sure in the town of Newmarket. We just want to be strategic about them and make sure that they happen in the right locations and that they're really well designed. And of course, when we talk about tall buildings, we want to make sure that they are, given their landmark status, really imageable. So our focus is often on creating a clear base, middle, and top on these buildings and making sure that whether they're experienced at ground level by a pedestrian walking by, or maybe at a bit of a quicker speed by someone driving directly by the building, or for someone maybe 10 blocks over who can see the upper 5 or 6 stories of the building from far away, and it's really defining their skyline. So we want to make sure that tall buildings really read at each of these scales. But of course, the most important thing about tall buildings and the potentially most contentious part is really that middle portion or that tower element, because this has the greatest impact on the surrounding communities and streetscapes. So with the guidelines, we really want to make sure that we put guidelines in place to make sure that these towers are appropriately designed, so that they're appropriately situated on the podium, so that they're further back from the street, or as far as possible from established neighborhoods, to make sure that we're minimizing any potential shadows or overlook. And similar on the idea of shadows, making sure that the buildings have smaller footprints. So where shadows are created, they tend to pass by quickly, and no area is left in shadows for longer than necessary. And making sure that there are no shadow impacts at all over public parks and things like that. And then in instances where there might be towers that are located closer to each other, making sure that they have appropriate separation between those two towers to allow clear views again, and minimize sort of the cumulative shadow impacts of those buildings. And then finally, just again, given the visibility of these tower aspects, making sure that they don't appear as sort of just one large mass in the sky. So making sure that they're well articulated, and that they use a mixture of materials and design elements in order to create, break those buildings up and make them sort of appear smaller in the distance. Finally, as part of these guidelines, we'll be looking at privately owned public spaces, or POPs, within the urban centers, the Young and Davis urban centers. And when I say, as the name implies, POPs, or privately owned public spaces, are really spaces within private developments that are accessible to the public. And these privately owned public spaces can take a number of forms. So they can be smaller plazas, they can be courtyards, they can be little parkettes. In larger developments, they could actually be potentially neighborhood parks. So they really could take a number of forms and shapes and sizes and uses. But as cities intensify, and as we don't really have in these more denser urban areas, a lot of opportunities for large swaths of public open space, POPs really are integral in helping to create this network of urban open spaces, and to make sure that all people who live within the town of Newmarket have access to public open space within close walking distance. So again, we'll build on the town's parkland dedication bylaw that we discussed earlier, to make sure that we put proper guidelines in place to really guide the development of these POPs. And again, the most important thing when you're talking about POPs is that they appear and are welcoming to the general public. So looking at things like the size and shape, and making sure that they're actually usable. They're at a size and shape that is usable and functional. Making sure that they're safe and visible and easily accessible, so they're not behind a building where people don't feel like they're really supposed to access them. So hopefully they're located directly adjacent to the street, or where they can't, that there are clear pedestrian connections through, and things like ultimately signage, to make sure again that people know that these are part of the overall public park space network in Newmarket, and that they're welcome to visit and enjoy them. And that's it. I thank you for your time on this presentation, and I'm really hoping that through this presentation I've provided you with a bit of an overview of the process, that I've provided you with an overview of urban design in general, and why urban design guidelines are important, and why they're important in the town of Newmarket, and a bit of an overview of some of the different typologies that we'll look at through this study. But most of all, what I'm really hoping is that you'll stay invested in this process with us as we move through the next stages. And the first part of that, if you haven't already done so before watching this presentation, is that I encourage you to visit the project's website on the Town of Newmarket's website at heynewmarket.ca/urban design guidelines, or you can go to heynewmarket.ca, where you can complete an online survey to provide feedback to us on a number of the precedent images that you saw throughout this process. So letting us know what you like or dislike about those buildings, whether or not you think they're appropriate for the Newmarket context. And these are all elements, and this is all information that we'll compile and use to inform the development of the guidelines over the next phase of this process. So we thank you for your time. And if you have any questions or comments, you can also provide those on any of the websites listed on the section here. Thank you very much.